I think someone moved in the apartment. Oh no, I see someone.
At first, Deborah seemed like a simple victim of a robbery gone wrong. But behind every lie...
On August 10, 2023, the city of Zanesville, Ohio was finishing out an unremarkable Thursday evening when a call came into the police department that would set in motion one of the most transparently constructed, forensically demolished murder cover-ups that investigators in that jurisdiction had ever encountered. The call came in at approximately 8 o'clock at night. The woman on the line was barely coherent, her voice cycling between whispered panic and outright hysteria, describing a scene at her apartment that she characterized as a home invasion in progress. She told the dispatcher that the front door had been left unlocked, that the interior of the residence had been thrown into complete disarray, that she could not locate her boyfriend anywhere inside despite his truck being visible in the parking lot outside, and that she believed someone was still in the apartment with her. The dispatcher immediately recognized the severity of the situation and began directing the caller to retreat toward the hallway, away from whatever threat might be present inside. The caller said she was trying to move quietly because she did not know where the intruder was. Then she said she could see someone. The dispatcher radioed units and declared an active home invasion. Seconds later came the sound of a gunshot. Then came screaming. The caller had been shot. Every officer available descended on that address. What they found when they arrived was a scene that initially presented as consistent with the caller's account: a woman bleeding on the apartment floor from a gunshot wound to the left inner thigh, a residence that appeared to have been ransacked, and no sign of the boyfriend the caller had described. Deborah Frasier, age 36, was treated at the scene and transported to the hospital with urgent speed, leaving the responding officers to begin processing the apartment without her present. That absence would turn out to be enormously convenient for investigators, because what they found as they moved deeper into the residence told an entirely different story than the one Deborah had constructed. There was no evidence of forced entry anywhere on the premises. The supposed ransacking, when examined critically, looked staged rather than frantic. Papers had been distributed across the floor in a pattern that lacked the organic chaos of a genuine search conducted under pressure. Furniture had been overturned in specific locations but left untouched in others, with a selectivity that no genuine burglar operating under adrenaline and time pressure would replicate. And on the floor of the living area, torn cleanly and deliberately down the middle, was a photograph of Deborah Frasier and the man whose name was on the lease, Thomas Wayne Weddle. That detail, the ripped photograph left in plain view, was the kind of thing that exists in staged crime scenes and almost nowhere else, a detail selected for emotional impact rather than emerging naturally from a violent confrontation. When investigators pushed through toward the back bedroom, they found Thomas Weddle. He was dead. He had been shot once, through the top of his head, at extremely close range, and his body had subsequently been wrapped in a blanket, encased in multiple plastic garbage bags, and bound together with duct tape. He had not been dead for hours. Forensic assessment would later confirm he had been dead for closer to a full day before Deborah Frasier dialed 911 and reported masked intruders fleeing his apartment. Thomas Wayne Weddle was 66 years old at the time of his death, and by every available account he was precisely the kind of human being whose loss registers as a genuine subtraction from the world. He had spent the bulk of his professional life working for Kroger, rising to the position of store manager, and he was remembered by former employees not as a figure of authority who maintained distance but as someone who genuinely advocated for the people beneath him in the organizational structure, who treated stockroom workers and cashiers with the same consideration he extended to anyone else, and who created an environment where people felt valued rather than disposable. After retirement, Tom channeled his energy into the things that had always sustained him outside of work. He was devoted to woodworking, spending hours in focused, patient craftsmanship producing objects of genuine quality. He loved being outdoors, loved the natural world, loved long drives through Ohio countryside. He was an avid and enthusiastic Christmas decorator, the kind of person whose home became a destination during the holiday season, who approached the annual ritual of lighting and ornamentation with genuine joy rather than obligation. He attended church consistently. He was embedded in a community of people who knew him and valued his presence. And most centrally, most defining of his identity in the years after his working life concluded, He was a grandfather, and that role absorbed him completely. His grandchildren were not peripheral to Tom Weddle's retirement. They were its primary purpose. Into this life, Tom had allowed Deborah Frasier, 30 years his junior, to enter as a romantic partner and eventually a live-in companion. The relationship was characterized by those who knew them as unstable in the classic on-again, off-again pattern, the kind of arrangement that accumulates history and friction in roughly equal measure. Tom was still legally married to a woman named Callie, though the marriage had effectively ended, the separation precipitated by what Deborah described to investigators as Callie's anger issues and infidelity. Whatever the precise contours of Tom's emotional life in the period leading up to his death, the operative fact is that he had brought Deborah into his home, had given her access to his finances through a joint bank account, had invited her into the daily rhythms of his retirement, and had extended to her the kind of trust that can only be extended by someone who fundamentally assumes good faith on the part of the person they are trusting. That trust was exploited at every level, financially, emotionally, and ultimately fatally. The investigators who responded to the scene on August 10 moved quickly to the hospital to interview Deborah Frasier. She had been stabilized, her gunshot wound treated, and she was conscious and apparently oriented. Detectives from the Zanesville Police Department advised her of her Miranda rights before the conversation began, a procedural step that Deborah accepted without apparent alarm, signing the acknowledgement form and indicating her willingness to speak. The interview was recorded in full, and what followed over the next substantial period of time was a sustained exercise in fabrication that was, even by the standards of criminal interrogation, remarkable for how completely it unraveled under the weight of physical evidence that investigators had already gathered before entering the room. Deborah's account of the days preceding the 911 call began with Wednesday, August 9th. She explained that she and Tom had spent the morning waiting for the building's maintenance worker to arrive and replace a light fixture in the apartment. Once the task was completed, she told detectives, she had been feeling the pressure of anxiety she had been managing for some time, a condition she described as chronic and debilitating. She attributed the specific trigger on that particular day to academic stress. She had recently been notified that she was being dropped from her coursework at Full Sail University, an online institution based in Winter Park, Florida, where she had been enrolled in a creative writing program. The combination of that academic failure and her general anxiety led her, she said, to ask Tom if she could take some time away from the apartment, spend time with a friend, possibly stay the night elsewhere. Tom, she insisted, was characteristically understanding about this kind of request. She contacted a man she identified as Johnny, someone she described as an old friend from her early college years, someone she had known for a long time and with whom she shared interests that Tom did not, specifically video games and the kind of casual hanging out that Tom's personality did not particularly accommodate. Johnny, she said, lived on Oakland Avenue in Zanesville. She reached out to him in the late afternoon, after first making some casual phone calls to acquaintances she still had back in Florida, just checking in, catching up. When she connected with Johnny, the two of them drove around the surrounding area for several hours as daylight faded into evening, passing through Fryeburg and Dresden, listening to music, talking. Eventually they returned to Zanesville, and rather than having Johnny drop her at the apartment, she asked if she could simply stay at his place for the night, play some games, decompress. He agreed. They spent the evening at his residence, and she slept there. The following morning, August 10th, she and Johnny woke up around noon according to her account. She suggested they take a walk somewhere with good trails, and she proposed either Dillon Dam or Blackhand Gorge, two locations she was familiar with. They went to Blackhand Gorge and walked for a period of time. As the afternoon progressed, she said, her concern about Tom grew. She had sent him text messages. She had called his phone multiple times. He had not responded to any of her attempts to contact him, which she characterized as out of character because Tom was generally reliable about responding when she reached out. His silence, combined with the continued presence of his red truck in the apartment parking lot when Johnny dropped her off at the building, prompted her to go inside. Tom, she emphasized, essentially never went anywhere without his truck. If the truck was there, Tom was there. She described walking into the lobby, briefly seeing the building's cleaning woman finishing up her work, then approaching the apartment door and noticing it was unlocked. She had initially told the 911 dispatcher that she had needed to unlock the door herself, but when the detective pointed this out during the interview, she walked it back, suggesting she might have been mistaken, concluding that Tom had probably simply forgotten to lock it. She pushed inside. The apartment was in what she described as complete chaos, items thrown everywhere, her mind racing in every direction trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She noticed the lights were on in both the spare bedroom and the main bedroom. She called 911. While still on the phone with the dispatcher, beginning to move toward the back of the apartment, she said two men wearing what she described as full-body masks, covered from head to toe, emerged from somewhere deeper in the residence. The 911 dispatcher was telling her to back toward the hallway. She said she was too frightened to respond coherently. She kept moving backward. One of the two men, the one in the lead, produced a firearm. He advanced toward her with it. She grabbed the weapon with both hands, trying to redirect the barrel away from her body, seizing the grip with her right hand and wrapping her left hand around the barrel and cylinder area. In the struggle, the gun discharged and she was struck in the left inner thigh. Both men then ran from the apartment. She had no idea where they went because at that point she was on the floor in serious pain. The detectives listening to this account had, before entering the hospital room, already obtained and executed a search warrant on Deborah's mobile phone. Every search query, every timestamp, every piece of digital movement stored on that device was available to them in precise chronological order before she spoke a single word of her fabricated narrative. The phone data was catastrophic for her story. Beginning on August 9th, the day she claimed to have left the apartment to manage her anxiety, Deborah's search history documented a frantic self-education campaign on the operational basics of firearms, conducted by someone who had apparently just located a gun and needed to understand how to use it before a specific deadline. The searches catalog that day included queries about the visual characteristics of .22 caliber ammunition, the mechanical process of releasing the hammer on a revolver, methods for identifying what caliber of ammunition a particular revolver was designed to fire, the process of loading a revolver, and multiple entries relating to gun safety fundamentals. These were not searches conducted by someone with even casual familiarity with firearms. These were the searches of someone beginning from absolute zero, working through basic operational questions in sequence, in the manner of a person following a self-directed tutorial. The searches were not conducted out of curiosity or academic interest. They were conducted the day before Thomas Weddle was shot through the top of his skull with a revolver. Then came August 10th. At 8:16 in the morning, with Tom already dead and his body already wrapped in plastic and duct tape inside the back bedroom, Deborah Frasier used her phone to search for information about gunshot residue, specifically, how long GSR remains detectable on human skin and whether there were methods of removing it. She followed this with searches for court records from Lake County, Florida, and Muskingum County, Ohio. And the final search before she initiated the 911 call from the apartment later that afternoon was a query about how to permanently erase Google search history. She did not successfully accomplish that erasure. The entire archive remained intact, fully indexed, fully timestamped, entirely available to the investigators who were sitting across from her in the hospital room while she performed bewilderment and grief for their benefit. The forensic evidence recovered from the apartment corroborated the phone data at every point. The medical examiner's analysis of Tom's wound established that he had been shot from directly above or from an extremely close elevated angle, consistent with a shooter standing beside or directly over a seated person and firing downward into the crown of the head. The entry wounds characteristics, combined with the absence of any defensive wounds on Tom's hands or arms, indicated he had no awareness that he was in danger in the moments before he was killed. He was sitting in his recliner, watching television, and he was shot by someone he did not perceive as a threat. The trajectory and the position of his body in the chair, combined with the evidence that he had not moved or attempted to rise before the fatal moment, told investigators everything they needed to know about the nature of his last conscious experience. He never saw it coming. He never had the opportunity to react. After shooting Tom, Deborah did not call for help. She did not panic. She moved methodically through the apartment, gathering materials she had apparently positioned in advance: black duct tape stored beneath the kitchen counter, plastic garbage bags kept under the sink. She used these materials to wrap Tom's body where it sat or lay, and then to bundle and secure him in a manner that she presumably intended to facilitate eventual disposal, or at minimum to contain the scene long enough to execute the rest of her plan. The wrapping process left physical evidence of her presence that she appears not to have anticipated or accounted for. Strands of her hair were recovered from inside the duct tape binding and from within the interior of the plastic bags themselves. This was not transfer contamination of the kind that occurs through casual proximity. Hair does not migrate into the interior of sealed garbage bags or become embedded in adhesive tape through ordinary household contact. It gets there when a person handles those materials while actively wrapping a body, and the forensic team recovered exactly what they would expect to find in that scenario. Having secured the body, Deborah left the apartment. She reached out to Johnny and spent the next approximately 24 hours constructing a geographic alibi that was entirely truthful in its externals and entirely deceptive in its function. She genuinely was at Johnny's residence that night. She genuinely did go to Blackhand Gorge the following morning. Every detail of her account of those hours was accurate because it needed to be. Johnny could verify all of it, and she knew investigators would speak to him. The lie was not in where she had been during those 24 hours. The lie was in the premise that Tom had been alive when she left. The time of death established by the medical examiner placed Tom's killing in the morning hours of August 9th, before Deborah left the apartment, before she called Johnny, before she drove to Frasier and Dresden, before she played video games and went for a walk at Blackhand Gorge. By the time she dialed 911 on the afternoon of August 10th and reported two masked men emerging from the bedroom, Thomas Weddle had been dead for roughly a day and a half. The relationship between Deborah and Johnny requires examination because it illuminates both the depth of her capacity for sustained deception and the specific mechanics of the financial crime that investigators identified as the primary motive for the killing. Deborah Frasier had been involved with Johnny in a romantic capacity for approximately 10 years. This was not a casual or recently initiated connection. It was a decade-long entanglement that she maintained in complete secrecy from Tom, using a cover story of considerable elaborateness to explain her living situation to Johnny. She told Johnny that Tom Weddle suffered from severe dementia and that she was living with him in the capacity of a professional caregiver, a live-in nurse providing support to a man with significant cognitive impairment who could not manage his own daily existence. Johnny accepted this explanation. From his perspective, Deborah was a compassionate person doing difficult caregiving work for an elderly man with a debilitating illness, a situation that explained why she spent most of her time at that address while maintaining their relationship across a decade of intermittent contact. He had no reason to suspect that Tom was cognitively intact, romantically involved with Deborah, and entirely unaware that the woman living in his apartment had another long-term partner she had been stringing along for 10 years while using his home as her base of operations. The financial exploitation, as reconstructed by the Muskingum County Prosecutor's Office, was sophisticated enough to reveal that Deborah had invested real planning into the project of extracting money from Tom. The mechanism she employed to access his accounts was built on the same architecture of deception she applied to every other dimension of this case. She recruited Johnny, without his knowledge of what he was actually participating in, to telephone Tom while posing as a fraud investigator from Tom's bank. Johnny, believing he was perhaps helping with some legitimate financial matter that Deborah had described to him in terms he accepted at face value, called Tom and told him that his accounts had been compromised, that his funds were at risk, and that they needed to be moved or secured through a particular process. Tom, a trusting man who had no reason to suspect the voice on the phone was anything other than what it claimed to be, complied. Deborah was the one receiving and redirecting those funds. She systematically drained Tom's savings and checking accounts through this and presumably related methods until his combined financial reserves had been reduced to approximately $2,000. A man who had worked his entire adult life, built a nest egg through decades of employment, and retired with the reasonable expectation of financial security in his later years had been stripped of nearly everything he had saved by the woman sleeping in his apartment. The investigators theorized that the killing was precipitated by Tom approaching the threshold of discovery. Whether he noticed the state of his accounts, whether someone in his life flagged something suspicious, whether Deborah perceived signs that the financial deception was about to unravel, the available evidence suggests the murder was not impulsive but planned, executed with advanced preparation that included acquiring operational knowledge of the firearm she intended to use, positioning materials for concealment in advance, and establishing an alibi framework she could deploy immediately after the killing. The Google searches conducted the day before his death confirmed premeditation in a manner that could not be more explicit if she had left a written note. When detectives laid the evidence in front of Deborah during the hospital interrogation, she did not confess. She maintained her denial with a persistence that investigators found remarkable given the totality of what they placed before her. They told her that the 911 call audio, when enhanced and analyzed, contained no acoustic signatures consistent with two people running through the apartment and out the door, no footfalls, no voices, no sounds of a physical altercation of the kind she described. They told her that cameras covering the building's exterior and surrounding area showed no two masked individuals exiting at any point during the relevant time window. They told her that her DNA was confirmed on the murder weapon. They told her that the same gun used to kill Tom was the gun she had used to shoot herself in the leg, a detail that converted her self-inflicted wound from a piece of corroborating evidence into direct physical proof connecting her to the killing weapon. They told her about her hair recovered from the duct tape and the garbage bags. They walked through the phone search history query by query, asking her to explain in particular why a person who had never fired a gun in their life, a claim she made directly in the interview, was searching for information about how long gunshot residue persists on skin at 8:16 in the morning of the day they were speaking, 5 hours before she called 911 to report a robbery. Deborah's explanation for the gunshot residue searches was the most audacious element of her in-room performance. She suggested, obliquely and without full commitment to the claim, that the searches might have been related to a personal crisis she had been experiencing, implying that her inquiry into GSR persistence was conducted in the context of researching self-harm rather than homicide, and that any firearm-related searches on the preceding day were similarly connected to personal psychological distress rather than operational preparation for a killing. The detective's response was immediate and precise. A person who intends to harm themselves with a firearm and does not survive the attempt has no need to research how long gunshot residue remains detectable on skin. That question is only meaningful to a living person attempting to understand whether forensic trace evidence will persist long enough to implicate them. The explanation was not just implausible. It was logically incoherent on its face, and it collapsed the moment it was spoken aloud. She had also told investigators during the interview that she had never fired a gun, had never loaded one, could not load one even if all the necessary equipment were placed in front of her, and that the only exposure she had to Tom's firearms collection was a brief instructional session he had conducted for her safety purposes. When detectives pointed out that this claim was directly contradicted by a search history demonstrating that she had, the day before the killing, conducted an intensive self-directed research session on the precise operational mechanics of loading and firing a revolver, her response was silence followed by repetition of denial. She had no explanation that was internally consistent, no way to bridge the gap between claiming total ignorance of firearms and having spent significant time the previous day acquiring the precise knowledge she claimed to lack. Throughout the interrogation, detectives also pressed on the physical implausibility of her intruder account. She described grabbing the gun with both hands while the men advanced on her. She specified that she seized the grip with her right hand and the barrel and cylinder area with her left. Detectives noted that this description, volunteered without apparent awareness of its evidentiary significance, provided a natural explanation for why her DNA appeared on the weapon and covered the components she described. It was a pre-constructed cover for trace evidence she knew forensics would find because she knew she had handled the gun. The problem was that the gun was the murder weapon, that her DNA was on it in exactly the configuration her story described, and that the gun itself had been used to shoot Tom through the top of his head before it was used to shoot Deborah through the left thigh. She was not wresting the gun away from a masked intruder. She was using it to complete the final piece of the staging by wounding herself in a location that would be painful and visible but not life-threatening. The detectives pointed out another forensic detail that undermined the intruder story with particular directness. During the 911 call, Deborah had remained on the line and was apparently holding the phone throughout the encounter she described, the confrontation with the two masked men, the struggle for the weapon, the shooting. Investigators noted that the idea of simultaneously gripping a phone and wresting a firearm away from an armed man with both hands presented a physical problem. The 911 audio itself told them the answer. There was no phone on the floor audible in the recording. The call quality and background sounds were consistent with a person holding the device rather than dropping it during a violent physical confrontation. The apartment staging also raised specific questions that Deborah could not answer satisfactorily. The so-called ransacking included Valentine's Day cards that had been ripped apart and left on the floor, cards depicting Deborah and Tom together. No genuine burglar selects romantic memorabilia for destruction. No opportunistic thief pauses to tear photographs and greeting cards. These objects were destroyed and positioned by someone crafting an emotional narrative around the crime scene, someone who wanted investigators to see evidence of a deteriorating relationship, of conflict, of grievance, pointing attention toward the possibility of interpersonal violence without pointing it directly at the person who had actually committed it. It was a theatrical gesture that read as staging the moment any experienced investigator looked at it. Deborah tried, during the interrogation, to redirect suspicion toward Tom's estranged wife Callie. She described Callie as someone with significant anger management difficulties, someone who had been unfaithful to Tom during the marriage and whose emotional volatility might make her capable of violence. She speculated that Callie might have sent people to the apartment, might have orchestrated a break-in as a form of retaliation. Detectives noted that Deborah's description of hypothetical suspects shifted from two men to the possibility of Callie having dispatched them, and that the entire exercise in redirection was undermined by the fundamental impossibility of her timeline. Tom had been dead before any of the events in her story could have occurred. No intruder hired by an estranged wife could be responsible for a death that preceded the supposed invasion by 24 hours. When the detective informed Deborah directly that they knew she had shot Tom with the .22 caliber revolver, that the bullet had entered through the top of his head, and that forensic evidence established the killing had occurred while he was seated in his recliner, she said she had not done it. When he told her that her DNA was on the gun used for the killing and the same gun had been used to shoot her in the leg, she said she had not done it. When he told her about the hair inside the duct tape and the garbage bags used to wrap the body, she said she had not touched those materials for that purpose. When he asked her how she explained searching for information about gunshot residue persistence 5 hours before calling 911 about a robbery, when she had supposedly never fired a gun in her life, she said it was a curious question she had simply wondered about. The detective pointed out that a person planning to use a firearm to harm themselves, the alternative explanation she had floated, would have no logical reason to search for information about how long GSR stays on a survivor's hands. She had no response. As the interrogation continued and the accumulated weight of the evidence was presented item by item, Deborah's composure fragmented into episodic emotional displays that investigators found unconvincing. When told that Tom was dead, she performed visible distress, and the detectives allowed the moment to breathe before continuing. But the context of that performance, delivered in a hospital room by a woman who had wrapped that man's body in garbage bags the previous morning, drained his bank accounts through an elaborate con involving her other long-term romantic partner, spent 24 hours establishing an alibi at that partner's residence, and then shot herself in the leg to complete a staged crime scene, stripped her expressions of grief of any credibility. One detective exchanged a glance with his partner that captured the room's consensus precisely. They had seen performance before. This was performance. She was told that the game was concluded, that investigators were not in the hospital room because they were pursuing an open case with multiple suspects, that they were there because the evidence had already answered the central question and this was her opportunity to provide context before the process moved beyond the point where context could affect anything. She was told that remorse, honestly expressed, carries weight in how cases proceed, that the families of victims, that the communities affected by violence, are served differently depending on whether the person responsible chooses accountability or continued denial. She was told that the only person she was serving by maintaining her fiction was not herself, because the evidence was going to prosecute her regardless of what she said in this room. The only variable that remained was whether she would allow the people who had loved Tom Weddle to have any understanding of why this happened to him. She said she had not killed him. She said she loved Tom. She requested an attorney. Before the detectives left the room, they informed Deborah of the charges being prepared against her at that moment in municipal court: murder, an unclassified felony under Ohio law carrying a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole; felonious assault, classified as a second-degree felony; tampering with evidence; domestic violence; and firearms specifications attached to the primary charges, which under Ohio sentencing law require mandatory additional incarceration imposed consecutively on top of the base sentence, meaning life imprisonment plus whatever the mandatory firearm specifications added. Her bond was set at $2 million. One of the detectives, on his way out, told her to enjoy her stay. The room was cold and the words were colder, and they were completely accurate. Deborah Frasier ultimately entered a guilty plea to murder with a firearm, gross abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. The plea avoided a trial but did not alter the outcome in any meaningful way. She is currently serving a life sentence in an Ohio correctional facility. The charges of felonious assault and domestic violence, along with the firearm specifications, were resolved as part of the plea arrangement, but the sentence she is serving carries no possibility of release. She will die in prison. Thomas Wayne Weddle left behind 3 children and multiple grandchildren. He left behind a church community that knew his face and valued his presence. He left behind former colleagues at Kroger who remembered him as the kind of manager that people speak about years later when they're describing what it means to be treated with dignity at work. He left behind half-finished woodworking projects, and Christmas decorations he would never hang again, and a red truck that was still sitting in the parking lot when police arrived because he had gone nowhere. He had been in his chair, watching television, trusting that the woman who shared his apartment was somewhere out there managing her anxiety and would be back eventually. He had no reason to think otherwise. He had no reason to fear the person who had access to his home, access to his finances, access to his daily life, and a phone full of searches about how to load a revolver. The case against Deborah Frasier was built in less than 48 hours from the moment police arrived at the scene, and it was built not through sophisticated investigative techniques requiring weeks of analysis but through the straightforward application of a search warrant to a mobile phone whose owner had failed to successfully delete its contents, combined with forensic recovery of biological trace evidence from materials used to wrap a murder victim's body. The phone searches told investigators when Deborah acquired her operational knowledge of firearms and when she became concerned about gunshot residue. The hair in the duct tape told them who had handled those materials. The DNA on the gun told them who had fired it. The time of death told them that every element of the intruder story was temporally impossible. The surveillance footage told them no one fled the building. The 911 audio told them no physical confrontation of the kind she described had actually occurred. What the evidence collectively revealed was not a crime of passion, not an impulsive act committed in a moment of overwhelming emotional crisis, but a premeditated killing preceded by deliberate research, followed by methodical concealment, and then capped by the construction of an elaborate false narrative involving a self-inflicted gunshot wound and an invented home invasion, all executed by someone who had been simultaneously deceiving multiple people across years and who had been systematically stealing from the victim she ultimately killed. The motive, as articulated by prosecutors, was financial. The mechanism was deception. The outcome was a retired grandfather shot through the top of the head while watching television in his own living room, his body wrapped in garbage bags by the person who killed him, left in the back bedroom while that person drove to a friend's house, watched television, went for a walk through a gorge, and returned the following afternoon to call 911 and tell police that strangers had done this to them both. The grandchildren Tom Weddle loved most in his retirement life will grow up without him. The Christmas season he treated with such particular affection arrives each year as a reminder of his absence rather than an occasion for the decorating rituals he loved. His children carry the particular grief that attaches to a parent whose death was not the result of illness or accident but of deliberate, calculated violence committed by someone their father trusted and welcomed into his life. That grief does not diminish. It reconfigures. It becomes part of the permanent architecture of the people left behind, something that shapes every subsequent Christmas, every family gathering that has one person fewer than it should, every grandchild's milestone that Tom Weddle was alive to anticipate and did not survive to witness. Deborah Frasier is in prison for the rest of her natural life because she failed to successfully delete her Google search history, because her hair transferred to the adhesive surface of duct tape she used to wrap a body, because the medical examiner could establish time of death with sufficient precision to make her timeline arithmetically impossible, and because she shot herself in the leg with the same gun she had used to commit murder, ensuring her DNA was on a weapon that connected her directly to both the killing and the staged self-victimization. She failed at every stage of the cover-up, not through bad luck but through the fundamental limitation that no amount of meticulous planning by an inexperienced criminal can account for every forensic variable, and Deborah Frasier, despite the apparent investment of substantial time and thought into this scheme, was not a sophisticated criminal. She was someone who watched ghost hunting shows and enrolled in creative writing programs and thought she could outmaneuver a homicide investigation in Zanesville, Ohio with a staged apartment and a story about two masked men. The evidence disagreed. The detectives disagreed. The jury of facts assembled from her own digital footprint and her own biological trace and her own gun disagreed with particular finality. Thomas Weddle deserved better than what he got. The system, in this case, worked exactly as it is supposed to.